And now we come to the third installment in our series on musical terminology essential to learning about Beethoven's music. In music, the word form refers to how the music changes over time. In classical music, nothing simply starts and then continues in an undifferentiated manner until the very end. Even if it seems very uniform at first listening, on closer inspection, there's more going on. At the smaller time scales, at the level of a phrase endings are called cadences, from the Latin cadere, meaning to fall. Cadences are like punctuation. In music, just as in speech, the sense of punctuation can be achieved by a pause or a certain slowing in the rhythmic activity. But that's not necessarily the case. Composers typically did it with certain harmonic formulas. Here are the chords that are essential to a full cadence or an authentic cadence in classical music in a major key. Sound familiar? It's a formula, a cliché. It's a clear, unambiguous signal. That's the end. And just as you can construct a sentence from two independent clauses connected by a semicolon so that you have a slight pause in the middle of the sentence and then a full stop at the end, a composer could choose to create a partial ending by stopping on the second to last chord of that formula so that it doesn't sound quite finished. That's the half cadence. And when that happens, the composer is obliged to come back to that penultimate chord and this time proceed to the very last one to give us the full cadence, the authentic one. Those are examples in a major key. Here are their equivalents in minor keys. So the essential harmonic formula, the last two chords, and again a phrase that proceeds to that second to last chord and then stops on it. So that's the half cadence. And then here's the parallel version, which does proceed all the way through to the last chord of the formula, making the full cadence, the full stop. Now, if you study music theory, you can learn all the proper technical names for these things, but for the most part, you can get by paying attention to whether something sounds as though it's incomplete at the end of the phrase, in which case it's a half cadence, or whether it really sounds completed and final, and that's the full cadence. So that's cadences are punctuation which help to shape music at the level of the phrase. For the piece as a whole, how to shape time, how to create a sense of a coherent beginning, middle, and end. In classical music, composers achieve this through tonality. When a composer, such as Bach or Beethoven or Brahms, labels a piece as being in a given key, what that really means is that it begins in that key and it ends in that key. In the middle, it goes to at least one other key, and perhaps through several, before it returns to the key in which it started. In the 1700s, there were certain strongly established conventions about what the other key would be, if there were only one, or if there were several, what's the first other key that you go to. Now here's where your study of that circle of fifths diagram pays off, and depending on how confident you are in your memorization, you might pull out a copy to consult as I talk through this next portion. So if the home key is a major key, that is, one of the keys on the outer ring of your diagram, then it's going to move to another key, which is called the dominant, which is located one space clockwise around the outer ring. So if you start in G major, you go to D major. If you start in B flat major, you go to F major, and so on. And then, of course, to return from that key to the home key is a simple matter of going back one space counterclockwise. If the home key is some minor key from the inner ring of your diagram, the principal other key to which the piece will move is what's called the relative major, which is the major key that's located one space outward radially. So if the piece starts in E minor, it's going to move to G major. If it starts in D minor, it's going to move to F major. And then, of course, to get back, it's just a matter of moving one space inward again to where you started. Those are the essential relationships for you to know in terms of the ground rules when Beethoven started his career. Major key pieces move to that key that's one space clockwise on the diagram, and minor keys will move one space outward radially. In each case, you're moving to a near key, one that shares many notes in common. And if it moves through more than one key, those will also be nearby. You don't stray very far on the diagram. So that's the basic structural move. Start in a key, move away from it, and then come back. Now there are many specific templates for musical form. Here we will deal with just 3 that are most important to us for the music of Beethoven. The simplest is called binary form, and as the name implies, it's in 2 parts. The first part is labeled as A. Note this has nothing to do with the key of A major or A minor. It's just the letter A, the first letter of the alphabet, to indicate that it's the first material that we hear. The A section starts in the home key and then moves to some other key, and that A section ends with a full cadence in the other key. So on the one hand, it sounds like a complete ending, except we know it's not really over because we've ended in a different key from the one in which we started. So the B section then resumes activity in that other key and then moves back to the home key and finishes with a full cadence in the home key. This form is typical of dance music from the 1600s and 1700s. Each half usually repeats. So instead of simply hearing the A section and then the B section, we would hear A, and then B, B. Incidentally, the 2 sections are not necessarily of the same length. Here's a short example of a piece in binary form. This is by Johann Sebastian Bach. It's a bourrée, which is a dance. The B section happens to be twice as long as the A section. The piece starts in E minor. What key do you suppose it moves to? Check your diagram. If you said G major, yes, exactly. So the A section ends with a full cadence in G major, and then it goes back and repeats that first section. And because they're nearly related keys, it's a very smooth move to go from G major directly back to the E minor at the beginning. And then the B section starts in G major and then moves through a couple of other keys before it gets back to E minor and then ends with a full cadence in E minor. And then repeats that B section. The next formal template, slightly more involved, but still fairly simple, is what's called rondo form. This is typically used in the last movement of a sonata, string quartet, or symphony. It's usually at a fast tempo. And the rondo theme is the first thing that we hear, so it's labeled with the letter A, and it's in the home key. Then we move to something else, other material in another key, because it's other material, it's labeled as B. And then after the B, we go back to the opening A material in the home key, and so on. It could be in only 5 parts. The diagram here shows a 7-part form, but in each case, the norm is an alternation between the rondo theme in the home key and then other material in other keys. Here's a short example of rondo form from a string quartet by Haydn. This one happens to be just a 5-part form, so A, B, A, C, A, and then there's a coda at the end to reinforce the sense that we've arrived in the home key and now really we're ending the piece, not moving on to more contrasting material. And now we come to a dramatically more involved form. This is the supreme reigning form of not only the classical period, but also the 19th century, the Romantics. The history of this form, from Mozart through Mahler, is of composers taking this basic template and finding it incredibly useful for organizing longer stretches of music. The binary form is fine for short movements, but it doesn't work so well if you want to shape a longer stretch of time. So this is what composers found useful for that, and as you go through the 19th century, composers use it to shape longer and longer stretches of time. In Mozart's time, a movement using this template might last only 6 minutes or 8 minutes. By the time you get to Mahler, a movement using this form could last for half an hour. It's the form that's typically used for the first movement of a sonata or a string quartet or a symphony, and the first movement is typically in a fast tempo, allegro. So it's called sonata allegro form. Very often you'll encounter people calling it sonata form for short, but you should keep in mind whenever you hear the term sonata form, it doesn't refer to the form of the entire sonata. It just means the form that's typical of the first movement. The overall idea is that in addition to the contrast of keys, you have a contrast of thematic material and a certain dramatic struggle that plays out between these different themes and different keys. There are 3 overall sections, and let's take each one in turn, and then we can put them all together to reform this complex diagram of the whole. The first section of the piece is called the exposition, the section that puts the material out, that introduces the audience to the musical characters in the drama, if you will. So as you might expect, the first theme is presented in the home key. And then it will be followed by a second contrasting theme in some other key. And so in between, you need a transition. You need to get from the home key to another key. That is to say, you need to modulate from the home key to the other key. And this section will reach the other key, but not provide a full cadence. It will just end with a half cadence, and then when the second theme arrives, it confirms authoritatively the arrival in the new key. The second theme is then followed by at least one, often a series of closing themes, which tend to be less individual. They're more formulaic, and they're really just a way of confirming this other key. So they correspond to the full cadence at the end of the first half of a binary form. This material that's in the other key, the second theme, plus the closing theme, or closing themes, plural, are generally referred to as the second group. So that's the exposition. We start with a first theme in the home key, and then we move away from the home key to arrive at another key, and then introduce a second theme which contrasts with the first. Usually the first theme is more vigorous and active and dramatic, and the second theme is more gentle and lyrical, and in the gender-biased terminology of the time, that first active, vigorous theme was called masculine, and the lyrical, gentle second theme was called feminine. I don't write this material, that's what they called it. Even though we're talking about this as a three-part form, it actually derives from the binary form. So in performance, the exposition very often is repeated. The next section of the piece is called the development. The short version is that this is the part of the piece where we move from that other key back to the home key. But in contrast to the short, simple binary form in which we would move back fairly directly, in a sonata allegro form, the trip back to the home key is highly circuitous. We start off with incredible harmonic instability. So we're not just in the wrong key, but we move through a series of keys. The composer deliberately creates a certain sense of confusion in the listener. Where are we? Where are we going? What's happening? It's moving through several different keys very quickly, often without a full cadence, so they're presented indirectly rather than authoritatively. And the sense of confusion is often heightened by breaking up the thematic material. We don't get to hear full melodic phrases of what we were hearing before. It's just bits and pieces, jumbled, distorted, mutated in various ways. Eventually, after moving through this series of other keys, we will work our way back to the home key, and this section is called the retransition. And just as in the original transition away from the home key, in the retransition, we work our way back to the home key, but in a slightly indirect way, without a full cadence, so that we end on a half cadence, and that sets us up for the return of the first theme and the last section of the piece, which is called the recapitulation, in which we again hear the material that was presented in the exposition. And it's normally presented in the same order. We start with a first theme, and then we hear the transition material again. But now the transition is recomposed so that it resembles the first transition in terms of melody and rhythm, but now it doesn't stray from the home key. Or if it does stray, it manages to come back before the return of the second theme, so that the second theme, which previously represented a departure, is now reconciled to the home key. And likewise, the closing themes that follow now, instead of reinforcing the other key and the sense of finishing in the wrong place, they reinforce the return to the home key and finishing where we expected to finish when we started the piece in this key, and hence the end. So, putting it all back together, we start with an opening exposition which lays out the contrasting themes and contrasting keys and leaves us in a key other than the home key. Then a central development section in highly dramatic and unpredictable fashion takes us on a journey which eventually winds its way back toward the home key, and the closing recapitulation section in which we hear the prior thematic material again in the order we heard it before, but now everything reconciled so that it's all within the home key and the closing themes confirm the home key. Now this represents the simplest template for the sonata allegro form. There are countless ways to bend it, twist it, reinvent it, reinvigorate it, keep it fresh so the pieces following the form didn't become entirely predictable. Listeners would come with a certain set of expectations, but then composers could still find ways to surprise them. And over the course of the semester, we'll examine some of the